Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Breakfast is almost ready. I've set a place for you. Come, join me. Sharing stories around breakfast is as old as humankind. And today, in this beautiful setting, I'm reminded of a story that comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 21. Jesus was standing on the shore watching the disciples fish. They'd been out all night and they hadn't caught a thing. Jesus yelled to them, "Children, have you caught any fish?" And all I heard was, "No." "Well, cast your nets on the right side of the boat." Now the disciples didn't know that this was Jesus. Yet they'd heard this advice before. So they did it. They cast their nets at the right side of the boat. And they caught so many fish that they couldn't even haul them in. It was said 153 in total. All of a sudden, one of the disciples yelled, "It's the Lord!" Peter got so excited, he threw his clothes back on and threw himself right out of the boat into the sea and started swimming towards Jesus. The other disciples followed in the boat, hauling that big catch of fish in. When they got to the shore, they came upon a charcoal fire with fish cooking and bread. And there stood Jesus. And he said, "Come, have breakfast with me." He took the bread and he broke it, and he gave each of them a piece. He did the same with the fish. And they sat around and they had breakfast together. Now this is a great fish story if it ended there. 153 fish in one catch? A net so full they couldn't pull it in? And yet it doesn't end there. Peter has an encounter with Jesus that changed the way that I viewed communion. Are you ready for more of the story? Are you ready for the breakfast that will really feed you? Now that the breakfast is over, Jesus turns to Peter and says the simplest of questions. "Peter, do you love me more than these?" And Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know I do." "Then feed my lambs." He says it the second time, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Well, yeah, Lord, you know I do." "Then tend my sheep." Now Jesus says it the third time, "Peter, do you really love me?" Now Peter was getting pretty frustrated with this line of questioning. And he shouted, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep." I often think about that question. Do I really love God more than anything else? This is the third time that Jesus had appeared to the disciples since he was raised from the dead. Now in the community of Christ, once a month, I hear this call, this invite. "Come, have breakfast with me." And when I hear that, I hear the call, even if I'm in a church building, in a home, or even sitting by a lake. The invitation's for all to come to the table and be fed. And yet preparing this breakfast this morning is easy. I've done it 1,000 times. And yet sometimes I just go through the motions. I don't give it much thought. I just show up. When I come to take communion now, it's a whole nother story. I have to ask myself these questions. Have I encountered God this week? Have I dwelt in God's Word enough that I can embody and live out the passions of Christ? How well have I loved my neighbor? Have I even talked to my neighbor? And do I understand the commitment and the sacrifice it takes to be on God's mission? Now the disciples, they didn't know what to do when Jesus left. They were confused. So they did what they always did. They went back fishing. Jesus had called them to be fishers of people. And now their focus is back on the fish. Do we do the same? Do we, out of our impatience, that we haven't prepared ourselves to be on Christ's mission, go back to what we know best, back to our daily lives, not even thinking about the risen Christ? And that there's Jesus waiting for us with the fire. Now these are some pretty heavy questions to ask this morning. We haven't even had breakfast yet. Let me tell you another fish story. And this one's true too. I have 3 wonderful grandkids. Ethan, Hayden, and Jackson. You know, at the time of this story, they were 6, 3, and 1. Wonderful, rambunctious boys. They live about 6.5 hours away from us, so we don't get to see them as often as we like. But when they come for a visit, the house is filled with lovable chaos. 3 boys, 2 dogs to go with our dog, yelling and playing, dogs barking. Now that Saturday morning it was raining. Ethan had decided to go with his dad and spend the morning with him. And so the rest of the family was with my wife and I. And after all this wonderful, wonderful noise in the house, we decided it was time to leave. We had to go somewhere, get out of there. And so where could we go? Well, there's a wonderful fishing and outdoor and camping store right close to the house. So off we went. And when we got there, it was like an outdoor adventure land. The boys got to run around and touch everything and try everything. They got to see all the animals and the fish. They got to play with the rods and the reels, and they touched everything. And you know what? It was okay. And so as they went through these motions, all of a sudden, they came upon the great fish tank. It was huge, 3 stories tall, filled with all the fish from the local area. Little Jackson ran right up to it, and he pressed his whole body against it and his face, trying to introduce himself to the fish. Now Hayden was in the cart, playing with that new toy that he'd discovered. And us adults, well, we were content on just talking and watching the fish swim round and round in peaceful community. And they did that all in sync, except for one. Except for the long-nosed gar. Instead of swimming around with the other fish, it decided it wanted to swim vertically. And he'd gain speed and he'd go to the top, sticking his long nose right out of the water as if to look around. And this happened for quite a while. He kept swimming around, gaining more speed, and he'd shoot up and he'd stick his nose out of the water just to take a look around. And finally I noticed that he was gaining more and more speed. He went up towards the surface. All of a sudden, he bumped into the catfish. And in doing so, he launched himself right out of the water. Now, instead of falling back into the tank, he fell to the left, right over the side, coming down right towards me, along with gallons of water. I kept thinking, this can't be happening. I took a step back, and yet he hit me in the knee, and he hit the concrete with a thump. I still have the scar on my knee. It still hurts a little bit. Now the fish is out. Little Jackson had been watching this take place, and he looked up, and as he was looking up at the fish falling, the fish was on the ground, and he fell right on top of that fish, getting all wet from the water. Now we had all taken a step back, yet his mama very quickly realized, my baby! And she ran up and she scooped little Jax up in her arms and got him to safety. Now we were all in shock, but only for a moment. Because then I started looking around and asking the question, somebody's got to get the fish back in the tank. Come on, somebody grab the fish and throw him back up. I guess I didn't realize it was 3 stories up. In doing so, I kept asking each employee, what are you going to do? And when I did, they kept saying, that's not my job. The big fish tank, that's not my department. I'll get on the radio and call and see what I can do. So I overheard them on the radio. Fish out of the tank! Fish out of the tank! Is there a procedure for this? What do we do? And I heard on the radio the guy say, well, this has never happened before. I'll check into it and get back to you. But now that fish was still out of the tank, flopping around on the floor. All of a sudden, the manager finally showed up, his shirt and tie on, and he ran full blast right towards the fish. And in doing so, his feet hit that slippery water on the floor, and both his feet flew up, and he fell right on his backside. His head inches away from the fish. Now it seemed like that fish was counterattacking. His tail was just smacking that guy on the head, bow, 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 bow. Finally, his employees dragged him to safety by his heels. And yet still, nobody had picked up the fish. Not even me. It seemed like nobody had prepared themselves for this type of emergency. Nobody's willing to step up and do something about this. And yet as we stood there and we worried and we thought about what to do, out of nowhere, another man came, an employee of the store. He very calmly walked through the crowd and he bent down very slowly. He picked that fish up. Like I said, it was a 2-hander. And he started walking up the stairs. Now about halfway up the stairs, that fish started to wiggle and thrash. And he kept hold of it. He got to the top of the tank and he dropped him in very, very gently. And when he did, we all cheered and clapped. Yay, the fish is safe. Little Hayden was just going crazy. Yeah, the fish is safe. But I noticed when the guy turned away, he had grabbed a cloth and he was wrapping his hands, for his hands were now bleeding from carrying that fish. If you Google that long-nosed gar, it says not only do they have sharp teeth, yet they have spines all around their gills and their head, sharp as tacks. Now this man wasn't asking for thanks. He wasn't asking for help. All he cared about was the fish. In the words of John's gospel, he was tending the lambs and feeding the sheep. He came prepared to answer the question, do you love me? And that day, he said that he did. Now the disciples, they didn't know what to do. The disciples, they were confused, just like sometimes we are. They felt like they had jumped out of the tank and didn't know how to get back in. In our own lives, we feel the same way sometimes. Yet there was Jesus standing on the shore, inviting us to breakfast once again. Communion is like that. Jesus keeps inviting us back, keeps inviting us back to community. When we're in communion with God and each other, it's like somebody has just dropped us back into the tank gently, and we can come and sink once again. Who do you know that's outside the tank right now? Who do you know that needs just a little help back into the tank? Who do you know that is hungry and thirsty for more out of this life? In the community of Christ today, we celebrate communion. And that communion, we recognize the significance of the bread and the wine. We understand that it's God's eternal love for us. Yet when we think about those disciples, we have to take that to heart. Are we just going through the motions? Are we saying, it's not our job, it's not our department, we don't have a plan for this? Or can we encounter God and react and be a part of God's mission? Because God's engaging the world as we speak right now. God calls us to breakfast. How are we responding? There are times when I think, as Christians, we're doing a poor job. We're not responding. We're not seeing the world. And yet I get great joy when I see people step up and pick the fish up. I want to clap and cheer. And yet I have to look around and ask myself, why didn't I pick up the fish? Why didn't I stand up for God and say, here I am, Lord. Show me the way. In the community of Christ, our Doctrine and Covenants 164, 9 DNF says it this way. If you truly would be community of Christ, that embody and live the concerns and passions of Christ, the challenges and opportunities are momentous. Will you remain hesitant in the shadows of your fears, insecurities, and competing loyalties? Or will you move forward in the light of your divinely instilled call and vision? The mission of Jesus Christ is what matters most for the journey ahead. So the next time you hear Jesus calling, the next time you hear Jesus inviting you to breakfast, take a seat, sit for a while, eat the bread, drink the juice, and be ready to respond to God's call. In John's Gospel, chapter 21, verse 19, it ends simply this way, with Jesus saying, "Follow me."